Now, he does give a second argument designed to prove that God does not exist, and that is that there's no evidence for God's existence. Well, this is not a good argument, frankly, because in the words of a forensic scientist I once met in Australia, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because there's no evidence that the butler was the murderer doesn't mean that the butler was not the murderer. Or to give a scientific example, we have no evidence so far that there was an early inflationary era in the origin of the cosmos. But woe be to the cosmologist who says because we don't have any evidence of it, therefore it did not exist. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. He needs to give a positive argument against God's existence.
To use catchphrases as the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, I mean, that's philosophical bunkum. I mean, I'm terribly sorry. If God exists, you've actually got to find some real evidence. I'm terribly sorry that we scientists do base the way we think on evidence. I mean, if I say that I think that you're a kangaroo because I dreamt you were a kangaroo last night, that is not evidence of the slightest importance. I think you really, if you want to go, you look for evidence, you've got to find evidence.
Well, I said the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. He said, well, that's just a slogan. The point is that in order to justify the belief that God does not exist, you have to have some sort of evidence or justification for that. Otherwise, it's possible that God does exist. Even if all of the arguments for God failed, that wouldn't be evidence that God does not exist. So that in order to provide some sort of justification for atheism, for thinking that belief in God is false, he needs to give some sort of arguments, not just say there's an absence of evidence. And in any case, I have presented the evidence in tonight's debate.
Say I say to you, and I think it's partly in Richard Dawkins' book, I believe there's a teapot going around the earth very fast. I don't know any evidence against that. So do you think the teapot is really going around the earth? So there's the absence of evidence that the teapot is going around the world, not going around the earth. So therefore the teapot is going around the earth. I think one's in a bit of a fix here. If you want to say that the teapot is going around the earth, you really require some evidence that there really is a teapot there. Or say that I imagine, or I tell you, that I've seen fish that can talk. Very good Afrikaans. I'm South African, you see. And they speak, yes, their dialect is not that good, but they speak very nicely. Would you not like a little evidence for this? And the absence of evidence surely would make you doubt it. So when we come to God, it's not a question, the absence of evidence that there is no God, the absence of evidence that there is a God. There's not the slightest indication of evidence of the kind that we would use in science in our day-to-day lives for the existence of this supernatural being again.
What about this claim that in the absence of evidence for God, you're justified in thinking there is no God? And he gives the example of the kangaroo and the teapot. You see, the failure of those illustrations is that the reason we don't believe that I'm a kangaroo is not because of the absence of evidence that I am a kangaroo. Rather, it is the presence of evidence that I am not a kangaroo. Like, we have good evidence that I'm Homo sapiens. Similarly, the teapot example also fails, because the reason we don't think there's a teapot in orbit around the Earth is not because of the absence of evidence for such a teapot. It's because we have good evidence that no such piece of china has been launched into space by us, or that extraterrestrials have put it there. So it is the presence of contrary evidence. But tonight we've heard no contrary evidence against the existence of God. And so this is just an elementary logical point. A proposition is not shown to be false by the absence of evidence for it. The proposition could still be true in the absence of evidence for it. We just wouldn't know if it's true.
All right, let's talk about the second challenge now, which has been called the presumption of atheism. This is the claim that in the absence of positive evidence for God's existence, you should presume that God does not exist. that unless you have positive evidence for the existence of God, you should presume that atheism is true. In other words, on the presumption of atheism, atheism is a sort of default position, that if the theist can't sustain his burden of proof to prove that God exists, then the default position is atheism. God does not exist. So what the person who presumes atheism is true is saying is that there's a kind of differential burden of proof here, that the atheist doesn't really have any burden of proof to show that God does not exist. Rather, it's the theist alone who has a burden of proof. He has to prove that God exists. And unless he successfully carries that burden of proof, then the default position is that God does not exist. Atheism just wins by default. Now, so understood, I think that this idea of the presumption of atheism is really a confusion of atheism with agnosticism. It confuses atheism with agnosticism. The atheistic claim that God does not exist is just as much a claim to know something as the theist claim that God does exist. Both are claims to knowledge. Both are making assertions. God does not exist. God does exist. Those are both positive claims to knowledge, and therefore both of them require justification. By contrast, the agnostic is the person who says, I don't know if God exists. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know. In other words, agnosticism doesn't have anything to prove because agnosticism doesn't assert anything. Agnosticism really isn't a position as such. It's just a confession of ignorance. Agnosticism is just saying, I don't know. And therefore he has no burden of proof. But the atheist does claim to know something. He knows that God does not exist. And therefore atheism, like theism, is a claim to knowledge and therefore must have justification. Whereas the agnostic doesn't need any justification, merely to confess his ignorance. Now, when I say this, it is important to understand that I'm talking here about ordinary agnosticism. There really are two types of agnosticism. My teacher, Norm Geisler, often described these by saying there's ordinary agnosticism and then there's ornery agnosticism. Ordinary agnosticism is, as I say, just a confession of ignorance. I don't know if God exists. Beats me. I don't know. Ornery agnosticism is the claim you cannot know if God exists. That due to our limited intellects or apprehension of the world, it cannot be known that God exists. Now that kind of agnosticism, ornery agnosticism, does make a positive knowledge claim, right? It says it cannot be known that God exists. And therefore the ornery agnostic does have a burden of proof. He's making an assertion. He claims to know that you cannot know that God exists. So the ornery agnostic, like the theist and the atheist, does make a claim to knowledge and therefore does have a burden of proof. He has to justify that claim, especially since a lot of other people think that you can know that God exists. So when I say that agnosticism is the default view, I'm talking about ordinary agnosticism, which really isn't a position at all. It doesn't take a position. It just confesses one's ignorance. So at most then I think that we should speak of a presumption of agnosticism, not a presumption of atheism. Now, is there any comment or question on that first point before we move ahead? Yes, David. No, I don't think so, because the atheist is saying God does not exist. The ornery agnostic is saying you can't know whether or not God exists because our knowledge is so limited, because of skepticism, say. And so the ornery agnostic doesn't say God does not exist. What he's making is a claim about your limited knowledge. And he's saying you can't know the answer to this question, whether God exists. So it is different than atheism, you see. Oh. Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Fair enough. I think you're quite right there, David, that in fact, if you cut them, these ornery agnostics would really bleed atheists. You know, that it is, I think, merely a kind of device for maintaining a real atheistic view. They really don't believe, or they really believe God doesn't exist. But because that's so hard to defend, it really is hard to prove atheism. They'll take the ornery agnostic view and just say, well, you can't know the answer to that. But at least on the surface, these are very different positions, because the one claims to know whether or not God exists, and the other one is really saying we finite, limited, ignorant people just can't know the answer to those kind of ultimate questions. And I do think that latter view is one that you often find among students today, who are so overwhelmed with information from the internet and from the media and so forth, that they just sort of throw up their hands in despair about these ultimate questions and just say, no, you can't know the answer to these. And that would be a kind of ornery agnostic view. Yes? Okay, fair enough. He asks, is the question, what is God like, as well as does he exist? And certainly you're right. I'm just kind of taking the basic question as our starting point. And if the basic question can't be answered, the other ones can't either. So yes, it would apply to all the rest of these religious questions, basically. But I'm just using this kind of foundational one as our illustration. Well, yeah, that's a good question. If he's willing to admit that there is a creator of the universe, I think he's already well on his way toward theism. It may not be a biblical theism yet, but he's well on his way. And so I think, I don't know anybody that I can think of who is an atheist or an agnostic and yet is willing to admit that there is a creator and designer of the universe that is beyond space and time and yet is not God. I don't know of anybody who would hold to a position like that, because that goes so far in the direction of theism, you're already 50% there. Okay, yes, Doug? Yeah, the question was, do the ornery agnostics themselves recognize this distinction? Yes, certainly they do. Now, they don't use those clever, titles, but I think those are handy for remembering the distinction. But they might characterize it as maybe a hard versus a soft agnosticism or something like that. But I kind of like Dr. Geisler's terminology. All right, well, let me push on then. In fact, when you look more closely at how some of these people who claimed the presumption of atheism use the word atheist, you find that they are really defining the word atheism in a very non-standard way. If you push them to define what they mean by atheism, what it really turns out to mean is sort of non-theism. And that would include agnosticism as well as atheism, traditional atheism. In other words, they're not saying God does not exist. They're just saying, well, we don't know that God exists. And that's consistent with agnosticism. And it would also be consistent with old-line verificationism, which says that the question is meaningless. Because if the question is meaningless, it's also true then that you're not a theist. So non-theism includes traditional atheism, agnosticism, and verificationism. All of those would be examples of non-theism. And so some people who say, well, the presumption of atheism is correct, are really using the word atheism in this non-standard way to encompass all of these other views. For example, this is what Antony Flew, who's one of the most famous atheists, has written, and he is the person who championed this idea, the presumption of atheism. This is what he confesses. He says, the word atheist has, in the present context, to be construed in an unusual way. It has, in the present context, to be construed in an unusual way. Nowadays, it is normally taken to mean someone who explicitly denies the existence of a God. But here, it has to be understood not positively, but negatively. with the original Greek prefix a being read in the same way in atheist as it customarily is in words such as amoral. In this interpretation, an atheist becomes not someone who positively asserts the non-existence of God, but someone who is simply not a theist. Do you get Flu's point? It's like the difference between amoral and immoral. Somebody who is immoral is positively morally corrupted. But something that is amoral isn't immoral. It's neither moral nor immoral. The chair is amoral, right? The chair is not a moral agent. This podium is amoral. My eating green Jell-O rather than red Jell-O in the cafeteria line is an amoral decision. See the difference? It's not immoral, it's just amoral. And so Flu is saying that's what we really mean by atheism. We mean atheism. We don't mean that God doesn't exist. We just mean non-theism. Well, if that's what the atheist means by atheism, then that completely trivializes the claim of the presumption of atheism. Because on that definition, atheism isn't even a view. I mean, it encompasses three different views, as we've seen. And in fact, even my cat Muff turns out to be an atheist on this definition. Why? Because Muff doesn't believe in God. Right? Muff is not a theist. Muff is a non-theist. So it turns out that the Craig household has atheists in it on this definition. In fact, two atheists, because Puff doesn't believe in God either. So both Puff and Muff are atheists on this. Babies are atheists on this definition, right? Because they're non-theists. So on this redefinition, I think it completely trivializes the claim of the presumption of atheism. In order to know that God does not exist, you would still have to provide evidence and justification for that claim. All right, any question about that reinterpretation of what atheism means in an attempt to defend the presumption of atheism? Marion and Harvey took care of Muff and Puff while we were in Hong Kong and didn't know they had such infidels in their care. All right. Well, other advocates of the presumption of atheism do use the word in a standard way. Namely, the standard definition of atheism means the view that God does not exist. So sometimes they will use it in the standard way. And they do recognize that to make the claim God does not exist is to make a claim to knowledge, and therefore requires justification. But what they will say is that the very absence of evidence for the existence of God is itself justification for thinking that God does not exist. That it is precisely the absence of evidence for God that justifies believing that God does not exist. And so what they're saying there is that the absence of evidence for God justifies atheism. And that's point B on the outline under Roman numeral 2, the lack of evidence for God. They would say, yes, atheism requires justification, but the lack of evidence is itself the justification for thinking that there is no God. Well, I think that the problem with this defense of atheism was very nicely captured by a forensic scientist whom I met in Sydney, Australia, when I was lecturing at the University of Science and Technology there. Forensic science is basically criminology, study of forensics and judicial process and proof. And this scientist said to me, it is virtually an axiom among forensic scientists that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Think about it in a court of law. The fact that there are no fingerprints of the butler on the knife is not itself evidence that the butler did not murder the master. The absence of evidence doesn't mean that therefore the butler is not guilty. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In order to show that the butler is not the murderer, he would need to have some kind of positive evidence that he didn't do it. In other words, an alibi. That's what we call an alibi. Proof that he was someplace else at the time and witnesses saw him, or that he was somehow incapable of carrying out the murder, that he was physically incapable of doing such a thing, or some other sort of evidence that would show that he didn't do it. But the mere absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And so, in the case of the murderer, say, merely the absence of convicting evidence doesn't prove that he is therefore not guilty. Or to give an example from modern physics, in theoretical physics, you very often have the postulation of entities or events for which there is no positive evidence yet, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. For example, many cosmologists believe that in the very, very early history of the universe, just a split second after the Big Bang, the universe went through a super rapid or inflationary period of expansion. And then after this very brief period of inflationary expansion, it settled down to the more leisurely expansion rate that we observe today. Now, by the very nature of the case, there isn't any positive evidence for this inflationary expansion. Because if it did occur, it would have pushed all the evidence out beyond the range of our telescopes and our instruments to measure. That's called an event horizon. And this evidence would be out beyond the event horizon. So, by the very nature of the case, it's unobservable. But that does not therefore mean that it did not occur. Woe be it to the contemporary cosmologist who says that because we have no positive evidence of inflation, that therefore inflation never occurred. That would be clearly invalid reasoning. So the mere absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Or to get away from the little axiom, the absence of proof for something is not itself proof that that thing doesn't exist. Now, you may think, but surely there are times when the absence of evidence for something is evidence that the thing does not exist. And I think that's right. For example, the absence of any evidence for a planet between Venus and the Earth is surely a good reason to think that there is no such planet. The fact that we detect no planet between Venus and the Earth provides very good grounds for thinking that such a planet does not exist. So, clearly, in some cases at least, the absence of evidence can be evidence that something doesn't exist. But when is it valid to use the absence of evidence as proof that something doesn't exist? Well, let's think about it a little bit. Suppose someone were to assert that there is an elephant in this room. Well, now, our failure to observe the elephant would surely be good grounds for thinking there is no elephant in this room. In that case, the absence of evidence for an elephant in this room is good grounds for thinking there is no elephant in here. But suppose that someone were to assert that there is a flea in this room. Well, in that case, our failure to observe the flea is not at all good evidence that there is no flea in this room. There could be a flea in this room even though we don't see it or, feel it either. It could still be here. So what's the difference between these two cases? Well, I think it's evident that the crucial difference is that in the one case, if the entity in question did exist, we would expect to see it. If it did exist, we would expect to have evidence of it. Whereas in the other case, if the entity did exist, we wouldn't expect to see it. We wouldn't expect to have any evidence of it. So in the case of the elephant, if the elephant were in this room, we would expect to see evidence of it. And therefore, the absence of that evidence is good reason to think there is no elephant here. But in the case of the flea, if the flea were in this room, we wouldn't expect to have evidence of it. And therefore, our failure to see the flea is not at all good reason to think that there is no flea in this room. And thus, the absence of evidence is evidence that something doesn't exist only in the case that if the thing did exist, we would expect to have the evidence of it. And notice that in these kinds of cases, the evidence will be, or rather the conviction that the thing doesn't exist will be proportional to the degree to which we should expect to see evidence of its existence, and then the ratio with the evidence that we do have. In other words, if your expectation of what evidence would be there if the thing existed is very, very low, then even if the evidence for that thing is very low, that wouldn't be much reason to think it doesn't exist. Or if your expectation that if the thing existed was that the evidence would be very high, and that we do have quite considerable evidence for that thing, again, that wouldn't be very good reason to think that it doesn't exist. It will only be a good reason to think it doesn't exist where you should expect to see a considerable degree of evidence, and yet the evidence that we have is very inconsiderable. It would only be when that ratio between them is very disproportionate that you would have very compelling grounds for thinking the thing doesn't exist. Now, before I apply this to the case of God, is there any question about that, what we're saying? Yes, Doug? Yeah. Well, then this might relate to the question that was asked before about what is God like. In other words, let's take a very concrete example. If the Mormon God existed, we should expect to have very different kind of evidence than if the biblical God exists. Why? Well, because Mormons believe that God is a humanoid figure with a physical body that is living on a planet in outer space near the star Kolob. Many people don't realize that that's what Mormons believe, but in fact Mormons do believe that. They're polytheists, and it's a kind of gross materialistic polytheism. So our failure to discern the existence of that sort of being would be good evidence against Mormonism, I think. But it wouldn't be evidence at all against the biblical concept of God who transcends time and space. So I think that your question would simply require us to say, well, what sort of God is rendered improbable by the lack of evidence? Now, I'll apply this more to the biblical God in a second, but I want to just be sure everybody kind of gets the idea here of when the absence of evidence counts as a positive justification for thinking that something doesn't exist. Okay? We're all on the same page? All right. Well, again, the advocates of the presumption of atheism recognized this fact. For example, Michael Scriven, who was an atheist philosopher, his last name is spelled Scriven, for those of you who are taking notes. Michael Scriven maintained that in the absence of evidence, we're justified in thinking that an entity does not exist only if two conditions are met. First of all, he said, the entity would have to be something that we would expect to leave traces of its existence. It would have to be something that would leave traces of its existence if it did exist. And then secondly, he said, we would have to be sure that we have very thoroughly surveyed the ground of the evidence and are very, very confident that there is no such evidence of that thing. Only if those two conditions are met would the absence of evidence be good justification for thinking the thing doesn't exist. It has to be, first of all, the kind of thing that would leave evidence or leave traces of its existence. And secondly, we've got to be sure or confident that we have thoroughly researched the ground to be sure that we have any evidence of its existence if it does exist. Now, if that is correct, that puts a very different face on the matter, doesn't it? Because initially, remember, we saw that the presumption of atheism was sort of the easy default position, that the atheist could just sort of sit back and say, okay, you believe in God, prove it to me, and if you can't prove it, then I'm justified in believing God doesn't exist. What we now discover is rather the presumption of atheism has a very large burden of proof to bear. The atheist would have to prove that if God exists, that we should expect to have such and such a kind of evidence of his existence. And then secondly, he would have to prove that we have thoroughly researched the ground and found no evidence of his existence. And both of those, I think, are very controversial claims. It is controversial to claim that if God existed, that we should expect to see certain kind of evidence. And it's controversial to claim that we have thoroughly researched the ground and found no evidence of his existence. And you'll recall that this was the pattern of Austin Dacey's arguments in the video that we watched from the debate at Purdue. His arguments were all of this form. If God existed, we should expect to see X. We do not see X, therefore God does not exist. And I think both of those premises are eminently controversial. In the first place, it's not at all clear that if God existed, what kind of evidence we would expect to have of his existence. I mean, who are we to say that if God existed, what kind of calling cards he would leave? We don't know. And I think that's the real presumption of atheism, is how presumptuous the atheist is in thinking that he knows what kind of evidence there would be if God did exist. But then secondly, that second claim is also very controversial, that there is no evidence of God's existence. As I said in my debate with Austin Dacey, I think we've got the origin of the universe out of nothing a finite time ago, the existence of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, the existence of a realm of objective moral values, the historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and the personal experience of God himself. If God existed, who in the world would say that he's obligated to leave more evidence of his existence than that? I think that is supreme evidence of God's existence. So you see that this presumption of atheism turns out to be not an easy default position at all, but rather to be quite a controversial position that would require the atheist to muster a good deal of justification to prove that atheism meets those two conditions. All right, any question or comment about that point? Yes? Yeah. Well, now, I have never studied social science, so I'm totally ignorant of your field. But I would imagine, wouldn't I, correctly, that the social scientist would propose some kind of a hypothesis to prove or to explain some set of data that he's received. Now, what is the null hypothesis in this case? That's the opposite. All right. Now, but sometimes don't you find yourself landed in the middle, where you don't have evidence for the opposite hypothesis and you don't have clear evidence for the hypothesis, so you're left in the agnostic? Yeah, all right. Now, that just sounds like saying that the evidence that you have makes one hypothesis more probable than the other. But if you want to translate that into this presumption of atheism, what the person seems to be saying is that if there isn't any positive evidence for the hypothesis, that is itself evidence that the opposite hypothesis is true. Right. Yeah. Now, and it seems to me that that's just incorrect, because that, as Scriven acknowledges, first of all, you'd have to be sure you're dealing with something that would leave positive evidence if it were true. I mean, there could be social phenomena that occur that maybe wouldn't leave any kind of positive evidence. For example, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, maybe you're polling for a behavior that is so shameful that people would never admit it to the pollster. And so, you're polling people on how many have committed incest, say, or something. Well, you're never going to get an accurate sample because people won't admit it. So that would fail that first condition, that if it were true, you would expect to have a certain trace of it. But then the second condition that would have to be met is that, in fact, you don't have any evidence at all for it. But you may have some evidence for it, a modicum of evidence in favor of your hypothesis. And so the second condition might not be met either. And therefore, you wouldn't be justified in saying, well, I guess the opposite is true. So I think it would apply in the social sciences as well. You've got to first be sure that if the thing were true, that it is the sort of thing that would leave evidence of itself, of a considerable amount or measurable amount. And then secondly, you've got to be sure that you've thoroughly surveyed the ground. Now, in social sciences, for example, you might say, well, my sample was too limited. My poll was too limited. I didn't get the right sample, and so therefore it's no good. You see what I mean? You've got to be sure you've surveyed the ground adequately and found no evidence. I don't see how you can. I'm not sure what you mean by things that are absolutely not true. I mean, oh, well, sure, if you find that the not true is not true, right? But I mean that. Yeah, but here that's the whole question. I mean, the theist does believe that atheism is not true. The theist tries to give positive evidence for the existence of God, and that's what we did in the last several months. But now we're kind of leaving that aside here, and we're pretending that we have no positive evidence, for God to prove that God exists. And we're just asking the question, is the absence of evidence for God sufficient justification for saying there is no God? And what I'm arguing is that no, it's not, for the reasons that I just explained. Yes? Yeah. Okay. Well, no. Apply this to what we've been saying. For a long time, we had no evidence that there were other solar systems. Does that mean they didn't exist? Did the absence of evidence for other solar systems mean that there are no other solar systems? Well, that would be absurd. Why? Well, because we hadn't met the second condition. We had not adequately surveyed the ground because our instruments were too limited. But once our instruments became powerful enough to more adequately survey the ground, bingo, we did find evidence of other solar systems, and they were there all along. And so what the atheist has to say is that we have so thoroughly surveyed the grounds and found no evidence of God's existence that we can be confident there is no God. And as you say, I think that's enormously presumptuous and controversial. I mean, look at the evidence that has been discovered just in the 20th century based on things like the fine-tuning of the universe and the origin of the universe, which was unknown in the 19th century. Some other comment or question? That's been my experience as well. My experience has been that atheists are very often disingenuous about the degree of sincerity with which they've sought God. They will often say, oh, I have sought God. I've looked, I've tried, and I've not found Him. But then, in other contexts, you'll hear them saying really vicious and negative things about God, which show, I think, where their heart really is. Yeah, I found that too. That has genuinely been my experience. And yet, in certain contexts, they will tell you with all sincerity how they have searched and so forth. And they kind of force you, or they're trying to force you into make a judgment upon them. That you're not a sincere person or something. And I try to avoid that because we're not out to try to judge people's motives, which we don't know. But very often they will let slip, as you say, their true motives by this anger or this bitterness that comes out in other contexts. And that, I think, gives a true glimpse as to where their heart really is often. Yes. You're raising a good point here. The hidden assumption that the verificationists made was that there isn't any empirical evidence of God's existence, that there aren't any answers to prayer, there are no miracles, there is no good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, for the fine-tuning of the universe, and so forth. That was just all sort of assumed. But I think the theist can really challenge that by saying, well, yes, there's abundant empirical evidence for a creator and designer of the universe, but I don't even want to give them that much. I mean, I don't even want to get on that playing field because their principle of meaning by which they make this demand is illegitimate. So they need to be cut off right at the ankles by saying that your criterion of meaningfulness is wrong, wholly apart from the further question of whether we do have empirical evidence for God. Even if we didn't, the claim would still be meaningful, like the example of the solar systems that exist, whether or not we have evidence of them, they're out there.